HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Peter Liem. We'll talk to Peter about champagne and more. I'm your host, Sam Benrubi. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Peter Liem is an award-winning author, writer, wine critic, educator, and truly one of the world's great champagne experts. Peter is the author of Champagne, the essential guide to the wines, producers, and terroirs of the iconic region. Peter oversees ChampagneGuide.net, an online comprehensive guide to the wines and producers of Champagne. He is the co-founder, co-creator of La Fête du Champagne, and is a prolific deep-sea diver. Peter has brought himself closer to the region he loves, living in Champagne for over 15 years, and comes back to the U.S. every now and then. Peter, welcome back to the Grape Nation.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
I just want to mention that you last joined us on the podcast in 2017. When I think about the last time I spoke to you, it doesn't seem like over 4 years ago. And that was early in our podcast. So I thank you now for coming on, and I thank you then for sort of a fledgling podcast, putting some faith into it and coming on. So thank you. We're talking to Peter remotely via Zencastr. Peter, where are you right now?
Actually, I am here in New York at the moment.
Okay. All right. So I mentioned in the intro that you live in Champagne, and obviously you also come back to the U.S. Don't spend a ton of time, but tell us why you ultimately made Champagne your home. And for me, as a curiosity, why not Germany or Spain? and how do you split your time?
Yeah, well, so I've been in the wine trade since 1996, I guess just getting involved with Champagne. Certainly, Champagne was a very different place, and it was a very different environment back in the 90s. And of course, I was introduced to Champagne like anybody else in the wine trade, through major names and just trying to taste as much as I possibly could. In the late 90s and early 2000s, this was a period of tremendous change in Champagne, and so I began going to the region in 1997. That was my first trip there, and what struck me immediately was that the things that I was seeing on the ground were completely different than things that I was reading in books or even in magazines. It's nobody was talking about this stuff, and it had stuff to do with viticulture and terroir, and small producers that you never heard of, and all this kind of thing that we take for granted now. But in 1997, this was completely, this was, I mean, to somebody in an export market, this was completely new territory.
Right.
And so that became very interesting, and I kept going back to Champagne, every year, once or twice a year, and that's, even though I was working with the wines of the world, and I had a deep interest in many areas at the time. I was working a lot with Burgundy. I was very heavily involved with Riesling, in Germany and Austria and Alsace, but I think just this whole kind of story of Champagne, and seeing how rapidly the region and the appellation was changing, that really made me want to spend more time there. And
So
yeah, it
Go
got
ahead.
to a point where going there once or twice a year just wasn't enough. And so by the end of 2006, I had made plans to really relocate to France, and I made my home in the Champagne region. And I've been living there
any
ever
regrets not sooner?
well, I mean, it was, everything's a product of circumstance,
Right.
and certainly moving from one country to another is never an easy task. So it's all right.
All right. So you mentioned a lot of areas and topics that I think we're going to get into, some in, some depth. Let me frame our conversation by asking you this. You said you've been traveling to Champagne since 97, which is, a substantial amount of time, and probably as long or more than anyone. Let's get into it a little. Can you articulate some of those changes you refer to, significant ones and even the subtle ones, that you've witnessed through the years? I mean, and a bigger question is, has Champagne re-examined itself, and is there a new paradigm there? So that's a big question, Peter.
Yeah.
But I trust in you.
Well, I mean, this is really the story of contemporary Champagne. The short answer is absolutely yes. At the time, I think 25 years ago, Champagne. I mean, from all sides, from the producer side, from the consumer side, from the wine professional side, Champagne. The way that we treated Champagne was very different. We haven't historically. Well, when I say historically, that's like the last 50 years, right? We haven't always thought about Champagne as a wine. Champagne has been, more about branding, more about a product of celebration. Something you have on your birthday, and it all of this stuff like helps to sell Champagne, but it kind of detracts from its qualities as a wine. And for me, I always say that everything that's going on right now in Champagne is really symptomatic of a change in the way that we've viewed it. So it's about us actually treating Champagne as a real wine now. And so along with that come up all these other questions that we ask of any other wine, right? We talk about viticulture, we talk about vinification, we talk about terroir, we talk about all these other things, and that's just natural when you talk about a wine and a wine region and all of this. In the past, we didn't talk about that so much with Champagne, and so Champagne was really just about brand. It was like you would go to Champagne and you would talk about the Champagne process, and it was thought that, or not thought, it was said that it was lees aging and then the Champagne process that really gave the wine its identity, which I think even back then winemakers didn't believe, but that's what they would tell us as consumers. And so it was really around the mid '90s that the beginnings of the conversation really started to pick up steam. where you had these producers, you had these winemakers in Champagne really starting to question this paradigm, or the paradigm that we were in, right? And starting to, there was kind of a new generation who, for one, they were drinking other wines of the world, which hasn't always been the case. Back even just a short time ago, France was very, very provincial. And oftentimes, the previous generation wouldn't be familiar with wine regions even within their own country. And but you had this new generation who were not only drinking wines and visiting other regions, but maybe had gone to school elsewhere, had worked internships, sometimes even abroad, in the New World or whatever, or elsewhere in Europe, and so they were coming back and they were starting to ask questions about Champagne in the same way that other people in the wine world were asking questions, right?
So that prompted.
Yeah, that prompted a sort of re-examination of what are we doing here in Champagne, and what does Champagne even mean, right? At first you had these pioneers. Everyone talks about Anselm Salos, of course, right? Clearly he's like this godfather of this whole this whole thing, but and then you have other people like Francis Egli, who started quite early, but then in the mid '90s, people that influenced me were people like Pascal Agripar, Pierre Larmandier of Larmandier Bernier, Laurent Champ of Villemar, and so these conversations with them really made me think about Champagne in a very different way. And then shortly after this, then you have like the beginning of the 2000s, where you have another generation coming in and here's where it really starts to pick up steam. People like Jérôme Prévost, Fouette Sorbet, Cédric Bouchard, all of these guys started all around the same time, around like 2000, and a little bit later, like Raphael Baresh, came on to, he joined his family was already making excellent wines, but he rejoined the estate in 2004. Alex Charton in 2006, and so you have this this other generation coming in, which was very exciting, and then at this point, it sort of gained this critical mass where you really start to see the region changing, and also. It's not just about production. It's about it was about what was going on in export markets as well. Most notably in the United States, you had grower champagne being imported already, right? And Kermit Lynch already, was working with Paul Barra and
Terry Thies.
Well. Yeah, and so other people were working with individual producers. Terry Thies was the first to really come out and say, here is a portfolio of champagnes that you've never heard of.
Right.
And that was really powerful. That was game changing.
Right.
And so and so even though he wasn't the first to import grower champagne, I think he did the most to really get the conversation going here in the States.
Right.
And that had an effect even back in Champagne, because the U.S. is a major champagne market. It had an effect in other export markets, where people are like, oh, what's going on here? Maybe we need to pay attention to this too. But then I think that encouraged this kind of newer generation to to start going in their own direction, and seeing that there were markets interested in what they were doing.
It's fair to say, based on what you're saying, in the early 2000s, that was really the launch I don't know, the beginning of the grower champagne market, because you refer to Salos, who was sort of older school but new thinking, and then other makers that, were of a newer generation, and then a category of growers. Is that fair to assess it that way?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I suppose. Back when I started in the wine trade, in the mid '90s, there were, we did see a few champagne growers, but they were, nobody really knew who they were. They were definitely a hand sell. I mean, I remember, working in California, my sales rep for Salos would come in with a bag with the entire range and, want to take me to dinner so that I could taste these wines. And,
where are they
try
now, right?
On them.
Yeah, where are they now? It's crazy.
Yeah. It's
Burgundy's similar too, it's just available and cheaper,
Absolutely. I mean, back then, we could drink all the Burgundy that we wanted. And it's, and that's certainly changed.
So tell me something about grower champagne. A couple of things. Take a few seconds to, describe or define what it is. But the question is, these growers that are now making champagne, and you'll define what and how they do it, they were growing and selling to the large houses? They weren't bottling for themselves?
It depends. So yeah, the distinction that we make, between like growers and houses, basically, we think about grower champagne. I mean, things are changing, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when we think about grower champagne, we think about champagne being made by the same people who grew the grapes.
Right.
Which is not always the case. Historically, champagne has been, the structure of the champagne industry has been one that's been very multi-tiered. Right? So you have people who own vineyards and who farm the land and they grow grapes. They might make some wine. They might not. They might just sell their grapes to négociants. People who are buying grapes and making wine, and that's always been very lucrative, right? Because your overhead is much less if you're not making wine. You're just farming, and then you grow these grapes, you sell them off, and that's very good business. So then négociants, houses, they would purchase. They might have vineyards of their own, but then they will also buy grapes from growers and then blend these together and make their wines. I mean, this has existed in Champagne for a very, very long time, for hundreds of years. So there have been certain periods in Champagne's history where economically this has kind of broken down, like 100 years ago, or 120 years ago now, beginning of the 20th century, there was a time of real economic difficulty where growers were sort of unable to sell their grapes to, négociants. Just they didn't want to buy because the market was down. They had too much wine in their cellars, whatever.
Right.
So some growers started to produce their own wine. Others sort of banded together to create cooperatives, and this is sort of the period where you see the emergence of cooperatives in Champagne, and things like that. Later on, after the war, after both wars, there was a period certainly after the First War, and then again, in the 40s and 50s after the Second War. You see a lot of growers again starting to make their own wines. Because they had difficulty selling grapes, right?
Right.
So in fact, a lot of these estates that were new to us 20 years ago, right? They had been making wine for a very long time. They didn't just start, some of them had just recently started, but most of them, had this family tradition for several generations of already producing champagne. It's just that their wines were being sold locally. and we
Right.
in export markets didn't really have access to them.
So people, when you hear that, you think, well, the grower is smaller, maybe he's paying more attention to viticulture. Um, I, I, I don't think this would be true, but does size have anything to do with quality? Not necessarily, right?
Yeah, this is something that I always have a problem with. It's like today in sort of whatever popular wine culture, it's become this sort of narrative that that smaller is automatically better. It's
Right.
so we talk about small growers and big houses. Those words are very loaded. They have implications, and I really fight against this all the time. It's I think size has nothing to do with quality. I think that I think it's a little bit dangerous and a little bit misleading, to think about, in these, to think about these terms in that way, like small growers versus big houses, and that's something that I deliberately avoid. Like in La Fête du Champagne, for example, Daniel
Right.
and I from the very beginning, we have never separated growers and houses. That was very deliberate. I wanted to do that, very deliberately.
Meaning making sure there's representation of everyone.
Well, and not even setting up. It's not even a comparison or contest, or it's.
The best makers?
Yeah, I'm interested in wines that are interesting, and wines that have something to say, and wines that are of high quality. Yeah. And I really don't care if you're a grower or a house. I don't care if you're RM or NM, or if you're if you're big or
Just
small.
tell everyone RM and NM,
Well,
negociant,
so-
and quick definition.
Yeah, so on every bottle of champagne, well, let's say every champagne producer is assigned a status, right? Depending on, it's basically your business structure. So an RM means that you are producing wine, but you're producing wine almost exclusively from your own grapes. There's this 5%, kind of like
So it's
little
equal
loophole,
to estate grown in a way.
yeah, it's basically estate grown.
Right.
That's what RM is. NM means that you have the ability to purchase grapes.
And some people would think, well, how do you control everything and your wine can't be that good? False, right?
Yeah. I think slowly in the market, people are kind of losing this attachment to RM. Maybe 10 years ago, RM was a really big deal among like consumers and wine professionals. It was a little bit misguided and a little bit misleading. People automatically thought that RM was a sign of quality, and it's really not. Even as early as even 20 years ago, I remember Pierre Larmandier was very adamant about this. He would always say, "Grower champagne is not a category." And
fair.
I loved that because, I would be in the vineyards with him. He is like militantly biodynamic, and he's just as a winemaker and wine grower, he's working at the highest levels. But, we would be out in the vines, and he would, point to a vineyard next to him and say, look at my neighbor. This guy is, he's an RM. He's a small family run grower, and whatever, the vineyards look like the surface of the moon. It's like pesticides, herbicides. He's like, there's what's so great about that? Just because you're a grower doesn't mean, doesn't have any implications at all, in terms of quality.
Right. Well, listen, Champagne is a tough place to grow grapes. The weather isn't great. There's all kinds of mildew, downy mildew. It requires treatments. Some people refrain from, some people treat. You mentioned earlier Champagne. There's always been a focus on the process. I think we are seeing a shift to the vineyards. Can you tell us about some of the improvements in viticulture, I think things are going in the right direction. There's more discussion of viticulture, which alone is a good thing.
I mean, by far, it's certainly viticulture is the number one topic in Champagne today, and I mean, and it's not just the avant-garde. It's not just the great growers that we know and love. It's the appellation as a whole. It's the region as a whole, and so it's not only the it's not only the like cutting edge growers. It's actually initiatives coming down from the CIVC, which is sort of the governing body of Champagne, trying to move the region forward, and it's actually been very successful over the last 20 years now. And so Champagne, it's always had quite a bad reputation as far as viticulture goes. Especially by the end of the 20th century. You went to Champagne and the vineyards looked pretty bad.
Like the moon, you said.
Yeah. And so I mean, Champagne was by no means the only wine region in Europe that looked that way. I mean,
right.
I mean, even today, like if you travel around Europe, it's it's not like everybody is organic and biodynamic and has these beautiful vineyards. In fact, Champagne, I don't even think is necessarily the worst looking place. But that doesn't even matter because it's not about comparison. It's about what are you actually doing. And so it was early in the 2000s that the CIVC, as I said, the governing body of Champagne, they kind of set out these initiatives to. They wanted to move the region forward, but it's hard when you have 4,000 growers and 4,000 wine producing growers and like 200 or 300 negociants, and everybody has different ideas. Everybody it's like herding cats, right? So. But they've actually been very successful, they point to all sorts of things, right? Reduction of herbicides, reduction of pesticides, but then also what's really interesting is that they've been working on sort of overall carbon footprint and other issues of sustainability. So, addressing things like recycling and waste management and water recycling and industrial waste and all of this stuff. And yes,
is the buy-in
slowly.
Is the buy-in good? I mean, when you look at the percentage of participation,
yeah,
I'm sure it's not where it should be, but I mean, do you see the trend going in the right direction?
I mean, it's definitely slow, and it's certainly more needs to be done, and and all that. I mean, you can criticize it all you want, but if you look at data, over the last 15 years, they point to things like carbon footprint per bottle. I don't know how they measured this, but they say there's been a 20% reduction, right? In things like industrial waste, treatment, recycling. There's been a 90%, or now let's say 90% of this, is being treated and recycled. Phytosanitary products, like when you talk about like fertilizers and
right.
Things, these sort of things that we're putting into the vineyards and the soils, we've seen a 50% reduction in that over the last 15 years. And so, I mean, that's encouraging, but then, they have these goals. They're looking at, actually, we're now in 2022. They're looking at absolutely zero herbicides in the region by 2025, which is not far away.
Wow, that's so close. No, not at all.
And they're actually on track to meet that goal, which is amazing.
And I don't want to get too nerdy, but the treatments that herbicides addressed, they're available and effective. It's just getting people to buy in.
Yeah, it's teaching people, alternative methods. It's making people, aware of what these things are doing to soils and giving them incentives. And obviously it's easier with the new generation. There are certainly certainly older growers are more resistant, and then their sons or daughters take over, and the task becomes easier.
Right.
And
because their kids are running around, the vineyards or the vines.
Yeah, and yeah.
So in a similar vein, I wanted you to discuss climate change, which it's a broad term, but it has an effect on everything we just discussed. Everything I read that Champagne is affected by the changes in climate. It's more prevalent there than other, wine regions. What are the effects? I mean, is it bud break, early harvesting, that type of stuff? And is it being addressed properly?
So, Champagne being a marginal wine region, historically Champagne has been really sort of at the northern limits of grape growing in France. So,
northern limits geographically?
Just in terms of climate.
Climate. Okay.
Especially like prior to the 1970s, or let's say prior to the 1980s, when the climate was very different, Champagne would have like maybe 3 good vintages out of 10.
Jesus.
And this is why the reserve program exists, and this is why.
Right.
I mean, this is something Champagne has always struggled with, forever, and so I think that when you look at wine regions that are near the edges, you feel the effects of climate change more, right? Just because there's a more drastic difference. So you look at like Germany, like the Mosel, or you look at and any wine regions that sort of like lie at the fringes, and Champagne is certainly one of those. And so looking at the last 30 or 40 years, I mean, there's no question that climate change is real. I mean, if you're still denying it at this point, then I don't know what to tell you. And it's brought entirely different conditions, and it's really changed growing seasons and changed threats. And so today what we're seeing really is that winters tend to be milder. So there's in general, there's less frost. Or during the winter, there's less of a freeze. There's less of really like a hard freeze.
Does that help, kill mildews and the absence of that, or not really?
In fact, it's not good. A milder winter is not good because in the past there are like various organisms. There could be there could be organisms that would normally be killed by the cold weather, killed by a freeze in the past, that nowadays are surviving through the winter. So that's one consideration of but regardless, winters tend to be milder now. And then what's really pernicious is that we're seeing this burst of warm weather quite early on in the year. So it can sometimes be as early as February. Usually it's like March, in the beginning of April. And so it's great for us as humans because, I'm sitting out in my backyard in a t-shirt in March. But in fact, in terms of the vineyards, this is a real problem because that accelerates growth at the beginning of the season. And Champagne is always susceptible to frost all the way up until like June and sometimes even July. So what happens is that we have this period of accelerated growth in the spring, and that won't last. It can't last. And so then when the frosts come, there's more growth to be damaged. So the effects of the frosts are harder.
Like potential bud break and development of the plant and all of that.
Yeah,
stuff.
The buds are farther along. They're more susceptible
because of the early warmer weather.
Exactly.
Due to global climate change, right?
Yeah. And then along also, climate change brings more extremes. Right? So you have more more incidences of sort of catastrophic events. So storms are stormier. Like frosts
Right.
are more virulent. It's so when the frost does come, usually it's worse off. It's worse in so many ways. Than it was
Everything
before.
is intensified.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Hard to come out of it. Other times you put up whatever, candles, boxes, and you could fight it off, but not in these current conditions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And then our July is always pretty rainy in Champagne, and then August gets really hot. Again, it's these extremes where you have this really cool July, and then you have this heat wave. You have this like enormous spike in August, which is kind of getting normal every year. But the thing is that the summers aren't as cool as they used to be. So in the past in Champagne, you would get either mildew or oidium, so downy mildew or powdery mildew, and you would very rarely get both. And today, because of the warmer overall temperatures, we really start to see both every year. And
Do they require separate treatment,
they
or
do.
one thing can ward them off?
It depends on what you do, I suppose.
Okay.
But it does require more treatment. And
Right.
I mean, mildew is always a problem in Champagne. Mildew, downy mildew has historically been the most pernicious problem, in the Champagne region in terms of viticulture. And so that's something that we have to contend with every year, and that certainly isn't changing.
Right.
But then going back to extremes, now we're seeing August actually be quite a problem. Just
Too
yesterday,
hot?
Yeah. So
And what does that do to the grape, the acid, the sugars, harvest time?
well, certainly it accelerates sugar production and acidity falls. So and very rapidly, right? So you have this very rapid accumulation of sugar. A lot of people make a big deal about acidity. It's for me, it's really not. It's not the main issue in Champagne. And Champenois focus on it too much because of this it's still this kind of 70s, 80s mentality that's ingrained in them. But also with this extreme heat, we see sunburn. There are grapes that actually shrivel on the vine. It changes the whole flavor profile of these wines.
Right.
And accelerated growth in that way is not really desirable. One of the things that makes Champagne what it is this long, cool growing season, and that creates a very particular style of wine. Right? That's what brings you elegance and finesse, and that's also what brings you ripe grapes at a very low level of alcohol. So sometimes in Champagne, people will harvest at 10 or 10.5 degrees and of potential alcohol. And in California, you're looking at this and you're saying, well, they're just harvesting green grapes, right?
Right.
But they're
13,
not.
14,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But the thing is that's the key. In Champagne, we're not harvesting green grapes. We're harvesting fully ripe grapes, but they only have like 10.5% alcohol because of this long, cool growing season. Right. And so now with these heat spikes, this is upsetting that. Right, to where to where now you have sugars really accumulating so fast that growers are forced to pick earlier, and that changes flavor profile. Certainly, that changes relationship between sugars and acidity. It causes you to completely rethink your whole style of wine. Really,
That's a substantial challenge.
absolutely.
That's unbelievable. Peter, we have to take a quick break.
Yeah.
When we come back, we'll finish up on that. We're talking to Peter Liem. Peter, as I mentioned earlier, is truly one of the great Champagne minds and experts in the country. When we come back, Peter, I want you to talk a little about dosage, chalk, and a few other things that are very much connected to Champagne. You're listening to the Grape Nation on Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back with Peter Liem.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Okay, we're back. We're back with my guest, Peter Liem. Peter, you were talking about the effects of climate change, and, it's a timing thing, and it involves the acids of the grapes, the sugar, when you have to pick, how you have to change and make the wines. I think when you talk about the word sugar, I think you think dosage, and could easily be one of the most misunderstood topics in Champagne.
Yeah, for sure.
To a lot of people, it seems to have a negative perception, especially now with the movement towards natural wines and all that. If it has sugar or dosage, it sucks. So a couple things, because I think you would agree with me that dosage is an important aspect of what Champagne is. Explain quickly, what dosage is, and try to get a little into the hoopla, that I'm talking about, if you can.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject, and it's one that's severely misunderstood, not only by consumers but also by producers themselves, which is ironic. So, dosage is the addition of sugar right at the end. So Champagne ages on its lees, right? and on these dead yeast cells left over from the second fermentation. Champagne that will go on for several years, however long. It gets disgorged, so that means that the lees are taken out, and then a little bit of sugar, a little bit of wine is put back in, and in that wine, it's made this solution with a certain quantity of sugar.
Wait, stop for a second. So the lees, is that sediment, or what's the word I'm looking for? Byproduct from the grape or whatever.
So it's actually physical dead yeast cells.
Dead yeast cells.
So it's from the second fermentation is done by putting sugar and yeast into the bottle, stoppering the bottle.
But you said the old lees are through the disgorgement are taken out, right?
Yeah,
then the dosage, adding sugar, is done.
Yeah, so that's
okay.
That's a different process. Yeah, So in the second fermentation, the yeast consumes the sugar. It creates bubbles essentially, and then the yeast die, and the yeast remain in the bottle, through this period of aging. So those
is there any effervescence before that? Adding the sugar
that's what
creates
the effervescence in a bottle of champagne.
I just want people to realize that.
Yeah. So that's how the effervescence is created, right? And so this aging on the lees, on these dead yeast cells, is a very important part of the champagne process. But those lees need to be taken out before you sell the bottle, right? Because nobody wants to drink that. Right? So the process of disgorgement is the process of actually removing those from the bottle. And so then before the final cork is put back in, normally there's a little bit of sugar that's put in the bottle with it, and that is the dosage. And so here's where all these misunderstandings come up, because we think of it as an additive, right? So it's and we think of it as perhaps an unnecessary additive, because who wants to put sugar in? I mean, I don't put sugar in my coffee. Like I try not to put refined sugar in just about anything that I cook or eat. So why would I want it in my wine? And the problem is that even producers themselves don't actually always know why it is that they're adding dosage. Some people say that it's to balance champagne's high acidity. So like the lemonade model, right? So like you squeeze a bunch of lemons into a pitcher, there's this ripping acidity, and you have to balance it out by putting some sugar in it, and then it creates something nice to drink, right? That's so some people are saying, well, this is the purpose of dosage. But it's not just that. In fact, it's not just to balance the acidity. In fact, dosage in champagne, in my book, I make the analogy of salt, where we don't always put salt in our food to make it salty, right? That's not the purpose of salt.
Right.
Salt completes a dish. It expands other flavors. It interacts with other flavors, and it completes the dish in a way that is very specific to salt, right? Like,
I think you use beef as an example, how it enhances it.
Sure. And so even if then your dish doesn't taste overtly salty, it's completed in a way that it wouldn't have been otherwise. And this is exactly what the addition of sugar does. This is exactly what dosage does in a champagne. And,
so why? Go ahead.
Well, and so the thing is that because of this, the specific amount of dosage is different for every wine. Just like the specific amount of salt is different for every dish, right? You can't just salt by numbers, right?
Right.
Like when you're cooking. And by the same token, you can't do this. You can't do that with champagne either. So people make a lot of, because dosage is measured in numbers, right? People make a big deal about 3 grams per liter, or 6 grams per liter, or 9 grams per liter, and this is too much, this is too little. It's just a number. Like the number.
I mean, there's like a zero dosage movement, which is silly, right? Because of everything you said.
Yeah,
it's
like saying. It's like saying I don't eat salt. My food, my food is so good that it doesn't need salt, and maybe that's the case, but that seems like a pretty silly statement. And there are champagne, because every champagne is different. Every champagne finds its balance point at a different level of dosage. It's entirely possible that a champagne might be complete without dosage. So one champagne might need 5 grams, another might need 9 grams, another one might need 0. But actually, I think that the ones that need 0 are they're much less common than you would think by seeing how many non-dosé wines there are, in the marketplace. Right. I think that. I think that there are a lot of zero dosage champagnes out there that should have some dosage, and and it's not at all that I'm against zero dosage champagnes. I mean, when I hit a good one, I love it. It's
right. Just as a broad thing, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, as a category, this doesn't make sense to me.
Like, wasn't there a story where Salos added sugar when everyone thought he shouldn't, and it helped the vintage, and it was a more ageable wine, which threw against common thought of all of that.
2003 was a really great example of that, where everybody said, "Oh, 2003," and it was a very hot year. The alcohol levels were high, the ripeness was very high, flavors were kind of roasted, acidity was low, and everyone was like, "Oh, if." Dosage is going to take this wine over the top. Everybody wanted to make non-dosé wines, in that vintage. And he was the reverse. He said, no, the way that all of these components interacting in this wine, I actually need more dosage than usual in order to make a complete wine. And he was right.
Yeah. Um, and the right guy to, prove that.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about another thing, and we can get pretty nerdy on this, and I don't want you to, because I have a thing called the wine list, which you did the last time you were on. I wanted to get your preferences on some wine, so I want to leave a little time with that.
Mhm.
But I think when people think of terroir, and more specifically the soil in Champagne, I think everybody, thinks chalky soils.
Mhm.
Um, and my studies show that it's not as simple as that. People think of Champagne as one region.
Mhm.
You are even controversial to this extent that you think that it's even more regions than the amount of regions they say, which, like I said, is a whole discussion. But is chalk the predominant soil, or is that what makes Champagne, or that's too simplistic?
I mean, short answer is yes. Simplistic answer is yes. Certainly, the majority of Champagne lies on this Cretaceous chalk. That's certainly the most famous soil type in Champagne. But Champagne is not only about chalk, and so the more you get into like the kind of nitty gritty details of Champagne terroir, the more you have to pay attention to things other than chalk. I mean, there's
Like,
on a macro level, there's like, the Côte de Bar in the Aube, which is not even on chalk at all. That's on Kimmeridgian. So it's the same. It's
okay.
exactly the same kind of
So the
Kimmeridgian
Aube,
marl as Chablis.
AUBE, is
Yeah,
a region where chalk is not prominent.
there is no chalk. Yeah,
Okay.
like literally, it's Kimmeridgian marl, which is an older soil. And it's exactly the same soil that's found in Chablis, but here they grow Pinot Noir and they put bubbles in it, and it's amazing. It's great.
Peter,
But
you have a very trained palate. This is almost a silly question, but I need to know. So you have a quality Champagne from the Aube, and then you have another region that's predominantly chalk. Blind right away, you could tell?
I,
Not necessarily, or mostly?
I'm not going to say that I don't make mistakes, because I always do every day.
I know that, but
but
generally.
yes, in general, yeah, I think that the Aube has a very distinct signature that I think that I think is easily learned. So
Right.
it's just, yeah, it's a matter of experience.
And then in other regions where chalk is prominent, does it appear in different ways? It's not on the surface, it's underneath,
So
it's
yeah,
older.
so a lot of the time with chalk, it really depends on what lies on top of it and in what quantity.
Ah,
So like if you look at the Côte de Blanc, right? The Côte de Blanc is when we talk about chalk in Champagne, this is like the purest example. This is where there's very, very little topsoil. Sometimes there's only like 20 or 25 centimeters of topsoil on top, and then it's immediately into this bedrock of chalk. So I mean, this is part of the reason why it's famous for Chardonnay, because Chardonnay likes really chalky soils, and Pinot Noir really struggles in that. But it's perfect for Chardonnay. But then Pinot Noir likes to have a little bit more clay in the topsoil. And so when you look at like the great areas of the Montagne de France, maybe you have a little bit more topsoil. You have maybe like half a meter to a meter, and this and the function of this topsoil is very important. Obviously the chalky bedrock is also important, but because especially the roots are going. I mean, with quality viticulture, the roots are descending and going down into the chalk.
right.
But that layer above the chalk has very important functions as well. As you move farther west in the region, like going into the western Montagne de France and then going into the Vallée de la Marne, the chalk actually descends farther and farther below the surface. And so you reach a point in the Vallée de la Marne, actually, where the chalk is really not significant at all, where you're really talking about other soils. Oftentimes, these soils are calcareous. So they can be various types of limestone. They can be various marls and sorts of things. But that chalky bedrock is so far below the surface that it's not really
No
it's not really
effect,
playing. It's not playing a role like it does, in the heart of Champagne.
Right.
So yeah, short answer is like chalk. Yes, it is the predominant soil type in Champagne, but it's
I
very,
see
very
how it
complicated.
varies. Yeah. All right. I'm shutting down our conversation on chalk, and we have precious few minutes left. So I want to do a couple things. One of the things I want to do is every week we ask our guests to participate in the wine list. You did this one 4 years ago, so I will compare notes. Everyone gets the same 5 questions. They've been the same 5 questions for over 200 interviews. They're fairly simplistic, but our listeners love to hear, what our guests are drinking. So the first question is, what are you drinking now? What's in your fridge? What are you tasting? Seasonal changes. Give me a few things. Obviously champagne, but what else?
Just you mean in general in the wine world?
Yeah, I mean, and now, the last week's month.
Yeah, I think, whenever I'm here in the States, because in the States, there's such a greater variety of wine than there is in France. So I'm always looking for things that I can't get in France. So like I always love drinking Italian wine, when I'm here in New York.
You can get good access to it.
Yeah, Northwest Italy, Northeast Italy, Sicily, it's
all the interesting places.
Yeah. German and Austrian wine, something that's very difficult to find in France. So I always like drinking that here.
Oh, I'm surprised.
So I actually drink very little French wine, when I'm in the States.
All right, so those are good ones. Peter, next question. I asked you this the last time we did the wine list. It's kind of the goofiest question on the list, but your favorite wine and food pairing?
I don't remember what I said last time, but
that's good. Either do I. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't champagne and oysters, but I'm going to check.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't know. I would maybe say like champagne and fried chicken.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Fried food of any sort, fish and chips or like anything fried, even just potato chips, like, it's fantastic with champagne.
With
but fried chicken of all sorts, like, it could be Southern fried chicken, it could be karaage, it could be like Korean fried chicken, like it could be whatever. But just the interaction of like fried food and champagne is amazing.
I totally agree. All right. This is a very probably easy but very tough question for you to answer. And I don't want you to feel that, it's exclusive. See if you can answer it. Do you have a favorite wine restaurant and or bar? And when you answer it, whatever you answer is not number one or the only one, but just places that you admire. I mean, is there a place or two in New York that comes to mind? Is there a place in Champagne that just when you walk in, it just feels great? They have the selection, the knowledge, the vibe. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, well, at home in Champagne, certainly Les Avisés,
What's the name of it?
Les Avisés, which is Solosa's restaurant, on the Jacques Solosa estate. I've been going there since the very beginning, since they opened, and I'm a bit biased because I'm friends with them.
I think you're right on this one.
But that place is amazing. The food is fantastic. The wine list is amazing. The prices are reasonable, and I tend to go there a lot. In France. Certainly you have like the grand wine list, like Les Crayères, but Racine, which is one of the best restaurants in France, is amazing. You have these wine bars, like Le Wine Bar is one of them, and Glupot is another. Where they have, that's where winemakers go to drink. Those two
That's
places.
the stuff I'm looking for you. Those are all good. I think you gave me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places. Say no more. I'll post those, and I'm happy to stay in France. All right, fourth question. And this question has morphed since I asked it to you. The question was favorite all-time wine. And I think when I started asking the question, I was fishing from guys like you who have access. What's the rarest, most expensive wine, you've ever tasted? I kind of can give a crap about that now. I
Yeah.
think the question is, what's that wine that had a significant impact in your life? That was, a realization, maybe something sentimental. Is there a wine or two that checks that box?
I mean, there's probably a new one like every month, right? But but I'm actually going to say 2013 Louis Roederer Cristal.
Why?
And this wine, so it's
It's
just been
more about
released.
the story than the wine.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
so yes,
Both.
so this wine was just released a few months ago,
Okay.
and so the wine itself is amazing. I mean, when I first tasted it, I wrote, "This is the best Cristal ever made," which is totally hyperbolic statement, but I think it's actually true. And the story behind it is that Louis Roederer is really at the forefront of viticulture in Champagne. I mean, they are on the bleeding edge, and since like so for the past 20 years now, Jean-Baptiste Lecaillon and his team have been working really hard at going back to what we talked about in the beginning about like rethinking the paradigm, rethinking like how we make champagne, how we grow champagne, what even is champagne. They've been thinking about all of these questions and really trying to address this in a very meaningful way. And so in the vineyards, they're doing things that seem like they're from the future. And so
for a bigger house too, right?
well, so what does it even mean, like a big house? Again,
Well, we
talked about this
discussed
too.
that a little.
But,
That they're capable of,
yeah. I mean,
volume.
Yeah. So, they make 2.5 to 3 million bottles a year, which in terms of negociants, is not large. It's not small. There's a certain volume and a certain sort of, I guess, it makes certain resources available to you when, you have that kind of money.
Right.
And so they've been doing amazing things. And in Champagne, time moves very slowly, right? Because you do something and you're maybe not releasing this wine for another like 7 or 8 years or 10 years or whatever. And so you won't really know what the effects are for a while. We don't see, we're only seeing now what people were doing, back in like the 2000s. And so, over time, like, we've seen Cristal, we've seen these changes in Cristal. 2002 came out, which was amazing. 2004 was similarly amazing in a completely different way. 2008, 2009, I thought was really fantastic. But then, in 2012, it's like it comes out and it's completely different, and people are like, wow, like this is as good as it gets. Like, this wine is amazing. Like, now, we're really seeing like what's happening at Roederer. And then 2013 comes out. And for me, it even surpasses 2012 in this, like, in reflecting Jean-Baptiste's ideas, in reflecting this viticulture, in reflecting like everything that's been going on at the house for, the previous, like, 10 to 15 years. And for me, this wine just encapsulates all of his philosophy, in this bottle. And that's really powerful to see. And
that's the 2013.
Yeah.
Fairly recent wine, Cristal. All right. Last question. And the question normally is best wine around $15, 15, 20, $22, a red and a white. I'm going to abandon that question and sort of ask you this. Where, how, what do we do to find the best value in champagne? We know that like any wine, champagne can be expensive, and that the lower ends are, you could find a pretty good $18, $20, Chablis or something, or Chardonnay. Hard to do that with champagne. How do we figure the best value?
Yeah. So, value, of course, doesn't always necessarily mean the lowest price, right? But,
quality to value
ratio.
to price. Yeah.
So two things. One, non-vintage champagne, I think, is the best value. Is one of the very best values that you can find in the wine world for truly age-worthy wine. right?
Explain why, because there's aged wine blended in, right?
Yeah, so it's I mean, non-vintage wine is typically a blend of various vintages, and so we think that, well, it's because it's designed to be more ready to drink upon release, then you should drink it now, and you shouldn't, and it's like there's no point in aging it. And in fact, it's totally untrue. Like any other wine, it's going to develop with time, and in some cases, it might develop a lot longer than you expect. I mean, I've tasted non-vintage wines that have been 20, 30, 40 years old, which have been amazing, and so these are typically the lowest priced wines in a producer's portfolio, and yet even if you're just putting it away for a year or two, this is like, I mean, this offers tremendous value in age-worthy wine. But then, I often think though that like the real value in a producer's portfolio is the regular vintage. It's because so a lot of times the standard portfolio of a producer there'll be the non-vintage wine, which is the lowest priced wine. There'll be like the prestige cuvée, which is the highest priced wine and the most special, and so people always want those. So the prestige cuvée tends to be priced quite high, the non-vintage quite low, and it's that middle child, the regular vintage, which always gets kind of lost in the shuffle, and you can often find those at really good prices. Right. And so I think, speaking of, taking a wine, putting in your cellar and, something that you can put away for 10, 15 years, I mean, those are oftentimes, really great places to look.
That's a great way to look at, to get the best quality and value. I didn't mention, but I post all the answers on our social media, so our listeners, can have access to them. Peter, I have to wrap up. Like I said offline, we probably could have discussed any one topic for over an hour, but I'm happy with everything we discussed and all your insights. Let me do a quick wrap up, and I want to get some info from you. If you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Subscribe to the Grape Nation podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. I can't make a better case for subscribing. When a guy like Peter Liem comes on, you want to know that by subscribing, it automatically pops up and it's ready for you to listen. So please subscribe. Follow us on Facebook at The Grape Nation. On Instagram, we're at SBenRuby, and on Twitter, we're at BenRuby. But you can use the hashtag The Grape Nation on both to get to us. As I mentioned, we'll post Peter's wine list on our social media sites. Peter, you do a lot of stuff, so try to answer this question with the right info. Where can we find you and all your work on social media and online? Let's start with the book Champagne. You can get that wherever books are sold. Support your local bookseller, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my Champagne book is still out there.
Quick question on that. Any thought of a revision, or are you working on any other book?
Not at the moment. Not anytime soon.
Okay. It's a seminal book, so it's very timely. All right. Your website?
So my website is champagneguide.net. And social media wise, I'm most active on Instagram, where my handle is just Peter Liem. Okay. But I'm on Twitter as well.
All right. And Peter, one day I'm going to do a podcast on deep sea and cave diving, and we will be able to talk about that a little more in depth. I'm sorry we didn't get to that a little. I want to thank our guest, Peter Liem. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Sam.
Kind of kick the new year off with champagne, and I appreciate that. Thanks to our engineer, Matt, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam BenRuby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. And thanks for listening.